The quietest rooms are often the ones where something is about to change everything. At 8:17 p.m. inside an upscale downtown restaurant in Chicago, the kind of place where every glass reflects soft golden light and every conversation stays just below a whisper, Lily Morgan moved between tables with calm precision that most people never bothered to notice. To guests, she was just part of the rhythm of the room, a passing shadow in a pressed black uniform, but to herself she was always watching. At 28, Lily had learned that silence was not emptiness, it was information. Every glance, every hesitation, every shift in posture told a story most people were too distracted to read. Tonight, the room felt normal on the surface. A couple celebrating an anniversary near the window, a businessman alone with a laptop, a small group laughing softly over wine. Yet beneath that surface, something subtle was off, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect song. Near the center of the dining room sat Ethan Cole, a man in his late 30s with a composed expression that gave away nothing, dressed simply but expensively, his presence quiet yet anchored, as if he belonged in places where decisions carried weight. He had arrived alone, ordered without hesitation, and had not once checked his phone, which already made him different from most guests Lily served. She had noticed how he didn't scan the room the way others did, how his attention stayed controlled, measured like someone used to being observed rather than observing. A few tables away, Lily caught the first irregular detail. The entrance doors opened not with the casual ease of diners, but with a deliberate pause, as if whoever stood there had already assessed the room before stepping inside. 3 men entered, dressed too similarly to be accidental, too quiet to be ordinary guests. They didn't speak to the host, didn't look at the menu displays, and didn't choose a table. Instead, their eyes moved across the restaurant in slow coordination, as though following a shared internal map. Lily's hands slowed slightly as she adjusted a tray, her attention narrowing without drawing attention. She had seen patterns like this before in smaller moments of her life. Never dramatic, never loud, just controlled intent wrapped in everyday motion. One of the men paused near the bar, another drifted toward the far wall, and the third remained near the entrance, forming a silent triangle that subtly touched every exit point without making it obvious. No one else seemed to notice. The guests continued their conversations, forks met plates, glasses were refilled, and the restaurant maintained its polished calm, but Lily's awareness sharpened with each passing second. She shifted her position slightly, not toward Ethan Cole directly, but into a vantage point where she could see both him and the newcomers in a single line of sight. Ethan, unaware of the subtle change in the room's geometry, continued his meal with the same steady composure, but Lily noticed something else now, a micro-adjustment in his posture, a stillness that suggested he had begun to sense the shift as well, even if he had not acknowledged it. The air felt heavier, not with sound but with intention. In moments like this, most people would feel fear without understanding why, but Lily felt something different: clarity. She took a quiet step forward, adjusting a chair at a nearby table as a simple excuse to reposition herself closer to Ethan's line without drawing attention. The men near the entrance had stopped moving entirely now, their attention fixed deeper into the room. Something unspoken had aligned between them, as if a decision was about to be made without words. And in that fragile balance between normal evening service and something unseen beginning to unfold, Lily Morgan realized that whatever was happening in this restaurant tonight, Ethan Cole was not just another guest, and she was no longer simply serving tables. The room had not changed on the surface, yet everything within it had shifted in a way that could not be measured by sight alone. Lily Morgan continued her service path with the same controlled movements, but her awareness had narrowed into something sharper, almost instinctive. Every step she took now was calculated not for efficiency but for perspective. She passed a table where laughter rose softly over a shared dessert, then another where a couple leaned closer in conversation, yet none of it registered the way it normally would. Her focus remained divided between the 3 men who had entered earlier and the man sitting alone near the center of the dining room. Ethan Cole still appeared calm, his posture unchanged, his attention on his plate as though the rest of the world remained irrelevant, but Lily had begun to notice something subtle in his stillness. It was not relaxation, it was restraint, the kind that suggested awareness without reaction. The kind that meant he was not unaware, only patient. One of the men near the far wall adjusted his position slightly, stepping closer to a column that gave him a clearer line across the room. Another had moved near the wine station, pausing long enough to appear casual while his eyes tracked movement rather than people. The third remained near the entrance, but his stance had shifted, no longer relaxed, now aligned with intent. Lily did not know their purpose, but she recognized structure when she saw it. This was not random presence, it was coordination without conversation. She turned slightly as she refilled a glass at a nearby table, using the motion to scan the room again. Ethan Cole had finally lifted his eyes from his plate. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable to anyone not paying close attention, but Lily saw it clearly. His gaze did not settle on any one person. Instead it moved in measured intervals, reading distance, exits, and timing. He was not reacting emotionally, he was processing. The realization tightened something in her awareness. Whatever was unfolding here, he was not a passive element in it. The atmosphere inside the restaurant remained polished and quiet, but tension often does not announce itself with sound. It appears first in hesitation, in the space between normal actions, in the way conversations slow without reason. Lily began to adjust her path subtly, no longer moving in straight service lines, but in arcs that allowed her to remain within observation range of both Ethan Cole and the men. She passed near a column where reflections from glassware fractured light into soft patterns across the floor. For a brief moment, her eyes met Ethan's from across the room. There was no expression exchanged, no acknowledgement, only recognition of presence. It lasted less than a second, yet it carried the weight of understanding that neither of them was alone in noticing the shift. Ethan returned his attention forward, but his posture changed by a fraction, shoulders settling into a more anchored position, as if confirming a decision made internally. The men near the wine station also adjusted, subtle repositioning that aligned them more directly with Ethan's table. The distance between them had not closed physically, but it had closed conceptually, as though invisible lines were being drawn across the floor. Lily slowed near a service cart, pretending to organize utensils, her mind fully engaged in mapping the space. She understood now that this was no ordinary dining evening. There was a target, a structure, and a convergence that had not yet reached its moment of action. Yet within that understanding she also recognized something else. Ethan Cole was not simply waiting to be acted upon. He was waiting for timing. And timing in situations like this was always the most dangerous element of all. The quiet within the dining room had begun to feel artificial, as if the space itself was holding its breath without permission. Lily Morgan maintained her steady pace along the service corridor, but her attention had become fully absorbed into the invisible geometry forming across the room. Nothing had been spoken, yet everything was being communicated through placement, distance, and stillness. The three men who had entered earlier were no longer simply positioned around the space, they were anchored. Each of them had settled into a location that subtly reduced the freedom of movement around Ethan Cole's table, without drawing attention from the guests or staff. One stood near a structural column that allowed partial visibility of the center seating area. Another remained near the wine display with a posture that suggested casual browsing but eyes that never stopped tracking, and the third had drifted closer to the rear corridor leading toward the kitchen, quietly reducing the number of unnoticed exits. Lily recognized the pattern now not as a threat in motion, but as a system preparing to activate. Ethan Cole remained seated, yet his behavior had shifted in ways most people would never detect. His movements were still calm, his posture controlled, but his attention had narrowed. He was no longer observing the room as a guest. He was measuring it as a space with variables. His gaze occasionally moved toward reflective surfaces, glass, polished metal, and even the subtle reflection from a framed artwork on the wall, as though he was confirming positions without directly acknowledging them. Lily passed behind a service station and adjusted a set of clean glasses, using the motion as cover to reposition her vantage point. From here she could see all four key points at once, Ethan Cole and the three coordinated men. The air between them felt increasingly structured, like an equation nearing its final form. A waiter passed nearby, unaware of anything unusual, balancing a tray of desserts with practiced ease. The normal rhythm of the restaurant continued, forks meeting plates, quiet laughter at distant tables, the soft pour of wine into crystal glasses, yet beneath it all, Lily sensed a divergence forming between ordinary life and whatever was being prepared just beneath its surface. Ethan Cole lifted his glass and took a measured sip, But his eyes did not leave the midline of the room. It was as if he was waiting not for action but for alignment. One of the men near the wine station adjusted his stance again, this time more deliberate, shifting weight from one foot to the other in a way that subtly reoriented his angle toward Ethan's table. The movement was small, but it broke the illusion of randomness. Lily noticed it immediately. This was not observation anymore, it was coordination reaching completion. She slowly stepped forward, pretending to adjust the placement of a chair at a nearby table, giving herself a reason to be closer to Ethan's line of sight without disrupting the natural flow of service. As she did, Ethan's eyes shifted briefly in her direction again. This time the recognition was deeper, not of identity but of understanding. He knew the structure was closing in. Lily felt a shift in her own decision-making. She did not know Ethan Cole's role in this unfolding situation, but she understood something fundamental about environments like this. When coordination reaches its final alignment, even silence becomes a form of pressure. Without breaking her professional expression, she subtly adjusted a table setting just enough to alter the clean visual lines between Ethan and the nearest observer. It was not noticeable to anyone not specifically tracking spatial continuity, but it introduced a fractional disruption in visual clarity between positions. Ethan noticed immediately. His gaze flicked once toward the adjustment, then returned to the room, recalibrating. The men around the space did not react outwardly, but their stillness deepened, as if they had registered a variable that no longer fit their expected configuration. The restaurant continued its illusion of normalcy, yet Lily now understood that the situation had reached a threshold where even the smallest deviation could determine the direction of everything that followed. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had reached a point where normal perception no longer matched what was actually unfolding beneath the surface. Conversations continued, silverware continued to meet porcelain, and the staff continued their work with practiced precision, yet Lily Morgan could feel a distinct separation forming between the visible world and the hidden structure that was now fully in motion. She remained near the central service station, her posture calm, her expression unchanged, but her awareness was locked entirely onto the spatial relationship between Ethan Cole and the coordinated positions around him. Nothing had been spoken, and yet every position in the room now carried intent. Ethan Cole remained seated, his movements still restrained and controlled, but the stillness around him had changed. It was no longer passive stillness, it was focused awareness. His eyes moved less frequently now, but with greater precision, pausing briefly on reflective surfaces and angled sightlines, as if confirming that every element in the room had been accounted for. The three men who had entered earlier were no longer simply observing. Their presence had evolved into a completed structure. One remained at the edge of the dining floor near a structural column. Another held position closer to the wine station where visibility of the central seating area remained uninterrupted, and the third had subtly adjusted near the corridor connecting to the service area, reducing the natural flow of movement in that direction. Lily recognized what had formed. It was not chaos and it was not random tension. It was containment without physical barriers, defined entirely by position and attention. She moved forward slowly with a tray of unused glassware, using the motion as cover to refine her vantage point once again. As she passed behind a seated couple engaged in quiet conversation, she noticed something critical. Ethan Cole had stopped eating entirely. His hands rested near the table, but his attention was no longer on the meal. It was now fully distributed across the room in measured intervals, as though he was counting internal timing, rather than reacting to external stimuli. One of the men near the wine station shifted again, this time more deliberate, aligning his shoulders directly toward Ethan's table. It was no longer subtle. The change in posture created a visible confirmation of intent for anyone trained to notice spatial behavior. Lily felt the structure tighten further. The distance between positions had not changed, but the psychological pressure within that distance had increased. She adjusted her route once more, circling closer to Ethan's table under the pretense of checking a nearby setting, allowing herself a clearer line of sight to both Ethan and the approaching alignment of the three men. Ethan's eyes briefly lifted and locked forward, not at any one person, but at the collective arrangement forming across the room. There was no expression on his face that indicated panic or surprise. Instead, there was calculation, as though he had reached a confirmation point in a process he had already anticipated. Lily noticed the smallest shift in his breathing pattern, controlled and steady, but now synchronized with awareness of timing rather than comfort. The restaurant continued its illusion of normalcy, but Lily could feel the invisible boundary closing in. The men were no longer adjusting positions. They were holding them. That difference mattered more than any movement. Holding meant readiness. Ethan remained still for another moment, then slowly placed his napkin down beside his plate with deliberate care. It was not a gesture of completion, but of transition. Lily understood instantly that whatever threshold had been building was now approaching its moment of resolution. And in that narrowing space between silence and action, she realized there would be no second chance to influence what came next. The moment felt less like time passing and more like time compressing inward, as if the entire restaurant had begun to fold itself toward a single point that no one was openly acknowledging. Lily Morgan remained in motion, but every action she took now existed on a different layer of awareness. To any observer, she was simply continuing her duties, replacing a set of glasses, adjusting a table arrangement, ensuring the seamless illusion of service remained intact, yet internally she was tracking a structure that had fully stabilized into something far more precise than earlier uncertainty. The three men who had entered earlier were no longer shifting or testing positions. They had settled into final alignment. One near the column, one near the wine station, and one near the corridor now formed a fixed perimeter that enclosed Ethan Cole within an invisible boundary, defined entirely by human presence. No physical obstruction existed, but the geometry was unmistakable. Ethan Cole remained seated, but his stillness had changed in quality. It was no longer passive or observational. It had become deliberate containment of reaction. His gaze moved once across the room, slow and measured, then returned forward, as though confirming that the structure around him had reached completion. Lily noticed that his hands, previously resting loosely near the table edge, were now placed in a position that suggested readiness rather than relaxation. Not tension, not fear, but controlled awareness of timing. One of the men near the wine station took a step forward that was not a step toward Ethan specifically, but toward alignment with the center axis of the room. It was subtle enough that most guests would not register it, yet within Lily's perception it felt like the final calibration of a system already in motion. The restaurant itself continued its performance of normalcy. A waiter poured water at a nearby table. A couple laughed softly at something shared between them. A plate was carried from kitchen to dining floor with practiced elegance. Yet all of it now felt distant, like a layer of reality continuing on autopilot, while another layer prepared to diverge. Lily adjusted her position once more, this time placing herself closer to the central aisle between Ethan Cole and the nearest exit corridor. The movement was natural, consistent with service behavior, but it placed her within immediate proximity of the structural tension she had been tracking since the moment the men entered. Ethan's eyes shifted again, slower this time, and briefly intersected with the far end of the room where the third man stood. It was not a stare, not confrontation, but recognition of locked geometry. In that exchange, Lily understood something precise. Ethan Cole was no longer being observed as a target. He was being held in place by observation itself, by the coordinated stillness of those who had already committed to a configuration that could not be reversed without consequence. She noticed a minute change in Ethan's posture. His shoulders relaxed by a fraction, not into comfort, but into acceptance of conditions as defined. The kind of acceptance that occurs when a person stops preparing to avoid an outcome, and instead begins preparing to move within it. Lily felt the room narrowing further, not physically, but perceptually, as if all paths of motion were slowly being reduced to a single unresolved moment. And in that narrowing, she realized the structure was no longer building toward possibility. It had already arrived at its point of execution, and all that remained was the instant when it would reveal itself. The air inside the restaurant had reached a point where even the smallest movement felt amplified, as if silence itself had become a surface that carried weight. Lily Morgan stood near the central service corridor, her posture unchanged, but her internal awareness fully locked onto the final configuration that had formed across the dining room. Nothing about the space had physically altered, yet everything had transitioned into a state of controlled stillness. The three men remained in their established positions, no longer adjusting, no longer testing distance, only maintaining presence. It was the difference between observation and enforcement of observation. Ethan Cole remained seated at the center table, but the quality of his stillness had shifted again. It was no longer simply awareness or preparation. It was now complete alignment with the structure around him, as if he had accepted the exact shape of the moment he was inside. His gaze moved once, slow and deliberate, crossing the room in a measured arc that did not reveal emotion, but confirmed comprehension. Lily noticed that the subtle environmental rhythm of the restaurant had begun to degrade in ways no ordinary guest would perceive. Conversations continued, but they were shorter. Movements continued, but they were more cautious. Even the staff seemed to instinctively reduce unnecessary motion, as if unconsciously reacting to pressure they could not identify. The three men held their positions without deviation. The man near the column remained fixed, his stance no longer casual but structurally intentional. The man at the wine station had ceased all pretense of browsing and now faced inward with complete focus. The third near the corridor stood in a position that effectively defined the final boundary of the space surrounding Ethan Cole's table. Lily understood now that this was not about approach. It was about containment through certainty rather than force. Ethan Cole slowly placed both hands on the table surface, not in surrender, not in defense, but in a state of readiness that suggested he had reached the final stage of calculation. His expression remained composed, yet something in his posture indicated that he was no longer waiting for external action. He was waiting for alignment of timing. Lily adjusted her position slightly, moving one step closer to the service pass where she could observe all critical angles simultaneously. Her movement was seamless, part of her role, unnoticed by guests, yet it placed her at the closest point she had been since the men entered. She now stood within the same structural field that defined Ethan's isolation. The tension was no longer increasing. It had stabilized at maximum compression. One of the men shifted his gaze fractionally toward the entrance, then back toward Ethan, as though confirming that external conditions were still within expected parameters. The absence of speech had become its own form of communication, and within that silence, decisions appeared already finalized. Lily felt something change at a level deeper than observation. The room had stopped building toward an outcome. It had reached the edge of the moment where outcomes reveal themselves without warning. Ethan Cole did not move, but his focus sharpened to a single point across the room, and in that instant, Lily understood that whatever was about to occur would not begin with action, but with recognition that action was already unavoidable. The moment before change arrived did not feel like a single instant, but rather like a narrowing corridor of time where everything became increasingly defined by what could no longer be avoided. Lily Morgan remained in her position near the service pass, her body still performing the language of hospitality, while her mind tracked the final alignment of forces across the dining room. The restaurant continued its outward appearance of normalcy, yet the internal rhythm had collapsed into a single focused tension that no longer expanded or shifted. The three men maintained their fixed positions without any visible communication. Their stillness was not hesitation but confirmation. Each angle they held now reinforced the containment structure around Ethan Cole's table. No one in the surrounding dining area appeared to understand what had formed, but Lily could feel the weight of it in every reduced movement, every shortened glance, every instinctive pause in conversation that had no obvious cause. Ethan Cole remained seated, but his awareness had sharpened into something absolute. His gaze no longer scanned the room broadly. It moved in precise intervals, returning always to the same invisible center point where intention had converged. His hands remained steady on the table, not relaxed, not tense, but positioned as though he had already accounted for every possible outcome that existed within the room. Lily noticed a final adjustment in his posture, a subtle forward alignment that suggested readiness not for reaction, but for transition. The room itself seemed to hold at maximum compression, as though the environment had reached the limit of how much unspoken intent it could contain without releasing it into action. A waiter passed near Lily carrying a tray of unused plates, and for a brief moment the ordinary motion of service contrasted sharply against the frozen geometry of everything else. Even that normal movement felt distant, like it belonged to another layer of reality that had not yet recognized what was unfolding beneath it. One of the men near the wine station shifted his weight fractionally, a movement so controlled it appeared almost mechanical, and yet it signaled something definitive. It was not escalation. It was final positioning. The man near the column turned his head a few degrees, aligning his sightline fully with Ethan Cole's table, and the third near the corridor adjusted his stance by a minimal degree that closed the last ambiguity in spatial coverage. Lily understood then that nothing further needed to be added to the structure. It had reached completion. Ethan Cole slowly lifted his eyes once more, and this time his gaze did not travel across the room. It locked forward, directly into the space that represented convergence itself. There was no visible change in expression, yet the quality of attention in that moment altered everything about how the room felt. It was no longer a question of whether something would happen. It was the recognition that all conditions for change had already been satisfied. Lily felt a subtle shift in her breathing, not from fear, but from the clarity of understanding that comes when timing stops being abstract and becomes immediate. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was structured. And within that structured silence, every element in the room waited for the same invisible signal that would determine which reality would follow next. The stillness that had taken over the dining room was no longer the stillness of calm, but the stillness of completion, the kind that exists only in the final breath before a system changes state. Lily Morgan remained in place near the service corridor, her presence still aligned with her role, yet every sense she had was now fully engaged in tracking the final convergence unfolding in the center of the room. Nothing new had been introduced. No additional movement had occurred. And yet everything felt as though it had reached the exact threshold where even the smallest deviation would define the outcome of what followed. Ethan Cole remained seated at the center table, his posture unchanged from the previous moments, but the meaning behind that stillness had deepened. He was no longer simply aware of the men around him. He was now fully synchronized with the structure they had formed. His gaze held steady, directed into the central space that connected all positions in the room, not as a point of focus, but as a point of inevitability. The three men maintained their exact positions without adjustment. The man near the column stood as a fixed reference point, the man near the wine station held his line of sight without deviation, and the third near the corridor remained positioned in a way that silently completed the spatial enclosure. There was no longer any ambiguity in their arrangement. What had begun as observation had fully transformed into controlled containment through presence alone. Lily understood now that the structure was not preparing for movement. It had already completed its preparation. What remained was only the transition from internal alignment to visible outcome. She felt a subtle shift in her perception, not of fear, but of clarity so precise it eliminated everything unnecessary. Ethan Cole slowly moved his hand from the table's surface and adjusted his posture by a fraction, not withdrawing, not advancing, but settling into a state that indicated acceptance of timing rather than resistance to it. The motion was minimal, yet it changed the quality of the room instantly. It was no longer a space holding tension. It was a space holding resolution. One of the men near the wine station slightly adjusted his angle, a movement so precise it functioned like confirmation rather than initiation. The others did not follow. They did not need to. The structure was already locked. Lily's attention remained fixed on the central axis between Ethan Cole and the surrounding positions. She recognized that what she was witnessing was not escalation, but completion of synchronization between all parties involved. The restaurant around them continued its illusion of normal service, but it had become secondary, almost distant, as if operating on a separate layer of reality that no longer influenced the core interaction at the center. Ethan Cole lifted his gaze one final time, and in that moment, nothing in his expression changed, yet everything about the atmosphere clarified into absolute certainty. The room had reached its final state of alignment. No further adjustment was possible. No additional movement was required. And in that suspended instant, Lily Morgan understood that what would happen next would not be the result of surprise or reaction, but the natural consequence of a structure that had already fully formed and was now simply waiting to reveal itself. The instant arrived without warning, not as a dramatic eruption, but as a quiet resolution of everything that had been building toward it. Lily Morgan felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air that signaled the transition from held structure to released intention. The dining room did not explode into chaos. It simply changed state, as if an invisible agreement had been completed. Ethan Cole remained seated for a fraction of a second longer, his gaze fixed forward, steady and unbroken. Then with absolute control, He exhaled once, a slow, measured release that carried the weight of conclusion rather than reaction. The three men across the room did not advance. They did not need to. Their positions held for a final confirmation that no further movement was required. The structure that had defined the space for the last several minutes no longer needed maintenance. It had served its purpose. Lily did not move. Her awareness remained fully engaged, but her role as observer had shifted into something closer to witness of resolution. Ethan Cole slowly lowered his hands from the table, not in surrender, not in submission, but in final acknowledgement that the conditions surrounding him had reached their end point. For the first time, his gaze softened slightly, not with relief but with recognition. The men near the wine station and column remained still, their posture unchanged, but the intensity in their stillness diminished by a subtle degree, as if a signal had passed through the system confirming completion rather than escalation. The man near the corridor finally turned his head away from Ethan's table, not abruptly, but with the calm precision of someone disengaging from a concluded alignment. Lily noticed it immediately. That single movement marked the dissolution of the structure. No confrontation followed. No disruption occurred. Instead, what unfolded was a quiet unwinding, as if tension itself had no purpose once its condition had been resolved. Ethan Cole stood slowly from his seat, adjusting his jacket with deliberate care. He did not look toward the men again. He did not acknowledge them. Instead, his attention shifted forward, toward the exit path that now felt open in a way it had not moments earlier. The three men remained where they were, no longer forming a system, no longer enforcing a perimeter, now simply individuals in a restaurant that had returned to its ordinary geometry. Lily finally exhaled in a controlled breath she did not realize she had been holding. The transformation had been complete without spectacle, without conflict, without visible consequence. Yet everything had changed in meaning. Ethan Cole walked past Lily's position without hesitation, his pace calm and steady, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred within the space he was leaving behind. As he passed, his eyes briefly met hers, not with explanation, not with gratitude, but with quiet acknowledgement of shared awareness. Then he continued toward the exit, and within moments he was gone. The dining room slowly resumed its normal rhythm, conversations returning in small fragments, movements becoming natural again, yet Lily remained still for a moment longer, understanding that what she had just witnessed was not an event defined by action, but by precision, timing, and the invisible alignment of human intention that had unfolded and dissolved without leaving any trace except in perception.